All right, so we got both the cars cleaned up. This one, unfortunately, it looks great on camera, but the paint is actually really hazy. I don't know if you can hear, but there's still a little grit to it. So I think what I'm gonna end up doing is clay barring this to try to really get it nice and clean. Shouldn't take very long because it's a pretty small car. But more importantly, what we're gonna focus on in this video is some electrical problems that we've been having. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna get this IAT sensor, our intake air, ambient air temperature, whatever you wanna call it, our intake air temperature sensor, which we have right here in our intercooler. It hasn't been working right, and I think after looking more and more and probing it out, I think the error was actually on me. I think I made a noob error. I have it wired to 5-volt reference and IAT in on the Mega Squirt, and after looking back at the wire diagrams, and the reason I wired it this way is because all the sensors, as far as like my coolant temperature, fuel pressure, throttle position sensor, they all use the 5-volt reference. Looking back at the wiring diagram, the IAT sensor, you wire it to IAT in and sensor ground. So I think all I need to do is cut it where I have it going to 5-volt and switch that over to going to sensor ground, and we should have good IAT readings. The other thing that was a little weird is that the actual calibration settings on the Mega Squirt weren't the same as what I was seeing online. I think it's just a typo in the software, in the tune. But I put in the correct settings, so that should also help us. But the main thing I think is that we need to get that 5-volt reference switched over to sensor ground, and we should start getting real IAT readings. After we get that figured out, the next thing we're going to do is figure out why our alternator isn't charging. But let's get that IAT sensor working first. So like I was saying, we need to figure out and then switch what I wired for 5-volt reference to sensor ground. So here's the connector for the air intake temperature sensor. So we'll probe it out, figure out which one is the one that I have wired to 5-volt reference. We'll cut it and tie it off so that it doesn't cause a short. And then we'll probe around. I know a couple of these other things use the 5-volt sensor ground, so we'll figure out, sorry. I know a few of these things use the sensor ground to go back to the Mega Squirt, so we'll just figure out exactly which one is the right wire to tap into. And we'll probably do somewhat of a temporary splice for now, because we can't, like, to get this all out, because of the way the coolant and everything is done, most likely, I mean, we could probably do it, but to get it out, we're gonna probably have to do a drain of the coolant system, which isn't ideal. So I'm gonna just try to do a temporary splice for now to keep things, keep it kind of simple. And then, you know, we're actually gonna eventually change this intake manifold for a STI or a WX1 and update the injectors. So at that point, that's when we'll clean up all the other wiring. But it just doesn't really make sense to do it twice now, because I'm not gonna take this off the road to do the other intake manifold, because that's pretty involved. So I really just want to do something quick and easy to get our sensors working so that we can get the tune dialed in. And then when we change intake manifolds and injectors, we'll just scale the injectors, and everything should be pretty easy to update at that point. And I will say, it really stinks, you know, when stuff like this happens, but it's also not the end of the world. You know, this is what project cars are, right? We figure out, get it running. It's never going to be perfect. It's always tinkering and fixing and revising, but as long as we can keep it going and we keep driving it, the best part of a project is being able to actually drive it. If you can't drive it, that's when things get a little miserable. But this actually shouldn't be too bad. We just gotta figure out here, this one I'm probing is the TPS in, so that one will stay. Okay. So the black and blue one will stay, or orange and red will go to sensor ground. Okay, not too bad. And to splice in, I'm going to be using these things called T-taps. So this will go on the wire coming from my IAT sensor. And then what I'll do is I'll clamp this. See how this squeezes in? Oops. I will clamp this around the wire that's going to sensor ground. And then I'll be able to just pop these together
and they will be connected. So it's called a T-tap. I'll put a link in the description so that you guys can grab these. So like I was saying, we used a T-tap here on the sensor return line and spliced that in instead of the 5-volt in our intake air temperature sensor. And that did the trick. We updated the calibration settings as well and the Megascore just to be safe. And now you see here we're reading 61 degrees. I don't know if you can see that or not. It's 61 degrees in our intake air temperature, and it is reading about 63 in the garage, so that's perfect. I couldn't be happier with that. Oh, what's the time? 63. So see, we're pretty good there. So at this point, we'll consider the intake air temperature sensor good, and we will move on to getting the alternator charging correctly. Okay, and I'm not positive, but I think what's going on with the alternator, the reason it's not charging is because we actually have an LED charge light in our dash. And from my understanding, for like the sense circuitry for the alternator to actually charge the battery, it needs to have a certain amount of load that you would get from the alternator light. And what I've been reading about is because we're using LED, there's not actually enough load for that sensing circuit to work properly. So what I've done, based on some online research, is I've actually purchased a couple resistors and diodes so that I can wire in a resistor to create load and then a diode just to prevent any backfeeding across that. So we're going to give that a shot now, and hopefully that's all it takes to get this alternator working correctly. And basically we have to do all this just because we're using LEDs instead of incandescent bulbs, from my understanding. So we'll give that a shot now. Sorry it's a little messy in here, but what we've done is we've probed out our wires, and we have our power and we have our power going into the light and our return going to the alternator. So what we need to do is just bridge a resistor between these in parallel to the LED, and this will allow enough load to basically trigger the alternator and know that it's charging. So we'll do that now. And then as you can see, I obviously need to go through here and clean everything up, but with like a project like this, there's been so much redoing and undoing of stuff that it really hasn't been worth cleaning it all up. So I think at some point we'll take it all apart and do it nice and neat once we have all the bugs worked out. But so right now, like I said, we'll add a resistor in here, and then we'll also add in a diode just to make sure that nothing backfeeds to the LED, and then we should be good. Just a quick update, you can see where I kind of spliced these in. And then I just twisted them around the wires, and now I'll heat shrink each end, and then I'll heat shrink the whole thing together just to make sure it's good. Alright, so I thought this was going to be a little bit easier, but now I'm remembering, and I'll show you guys a link to the video here. But when we originally did the alternator, we just bridged the power for the light across from the switch. So the problem we have there is it makes the circuitry a little bit more involved. So what I'm going to do is just go back. I just realized that because of the way I'm probing it out, it's not matching. I don't actually have what I thought was, I don't even have a line where I thought the power was going to the light. So I know I must have jumped it from something else. So we're going to put this light on its own circuit, which should only take a couple minutes, but it is a little bit of a pain in the butt because we got to take this panel out. And then from there, we'll have everything as expected. We'll wire in a diode down here just to make sure there's no back feeding. Now that we'll have a resistor across the LED, it would allow electricity to potentially go the opposite direction and go the LED is a diode, so if you bridge a resistor in parallel to it, it means the voltage can technically go backwards. So we're going to put a diode there just to be safe, to make sure none of that happens. And then we should be all good with the alternator stuff. Now that we have this open, I'm also considering, and now that we have to dig in here, I'm also considering possibly working on a horn and possibly working on finishing off our reverse lights, but we'll figure it out when we get there.
And you can see for the diode, I don't know if this is going to zoom in really or not. Okay. But all I really did was take my little crimp connectors and connect it to one side of the wire, and now I'll do the same thing on the other side and heat shrink over it. The only thing I'm not 100% sure is the direction the diode should be in, but we'll try it this way, and if it doesn't work, we'll flip it around. So if I got this right, which is a big if, what we should see when I start the car up is this light turn off, and our battery voltage should go from 12.5 to about 14 or 14.5. So let's give it a try. And immediately to 14.7, and the light went out. Couldn't be happier. Alright, and I'm going to go into this just a little bit longer because I'm hoping any of you guys might be able to benefit from what I learned. So basically, I'm going to draw it up for you. So if you have your light, say this is a regular incandescent bulb, and you got your positive and your minus. In a normal system, if, I don't know, say that's your alternator, what would happen is you would have 12 volts, probably fused, would go in to the light, the negative lead would go to the alternator. And what would happen is, essentially, I don't know exactly what happens, but the light goes out because it sees 12 volts from both the 12 volt source and your alternator. Your alternator, being part of this, now can charge your battery. I'm not exactly sure 100%, so I can't really explain the electrical to you, but what happens is you have your positive lead goes into the positive of the incandescent, and then your negative comes out and actually goes to the alternator and grounds, almost you could say. So what we had to do here, because we had an LED, which is a low resistance, so we have our LED, this is like an incandescent. What happens here is same thing, you have your plus and your minus, you have your 12 volt source, and we'll just put it over here, you have your alternator, and same, you have the 12 volts going in, and the negative going to the alternator. The difference is here, because you have such a low resistance, what we had to do is actually what you call in parallel in the electrical world, right here, we added a resistor. And what that does is that adds additional resistance, so the alternator, it's almost like simulating, this stack up is almost simulating your incandescent bulb, but without the resistor, you don't have enough load for this alternator to see that there's a light here and actually for this to work properly. So we added a resistor in to simulate that load, and then on top of that, right on this line, I forget the symbol, it's something like this, I think, we added a diode, and what that does is it just means that voltage can't run backwards, and I guess what this is called backfeeding. And what happens basically is if you didn't have this diode here, you could potentially have the voltage jump across this resistor rather than the LED is also a diode. Sorry, the LED is also a diode, so this basically means one-way road. When you put the resistor here, now it allows for the current to go backwards, which is bad. So we had a diode before the resistor, somewhere around here, to prevent any backfeeding. And I think what would happen basically is if you had backfeeding, you could have issues where the car won't shut down when you turn off the key. But long story short, because we didn't have an incandescent bulb and we went with LED, we had to add a resistor in parallel and a diode on the 12 volt line prior to get a properly functioning alternator and alternator light. I guess one more thing, just to be clear, the connection between the alternator and the LED isn't your main power wire. Your main power wire will make this extra thick. That would actually be going to, for my situation, it goes to the starter, and then at that point it bridges over to the battery. But what we're talking about here is actually the little connector. You probably heard it referenced to like LS or some ones, they have one wire or one pin connectors. Because we're dealing with the Subaru, we actually have 3 pins. So there's one that reads the 12 volts that you connect basically to the battery or the starter. There's one that would go to the ECM or ECU.
that would help you with like if your AC came on or if you had high electric load. I think it actually it ups your RPM or something so that you can you know, your alternator can keep charging when you have higher load. And then this third line we're talking about is what is usually referred to as your sense line, and that's what needs this LED resistor diode combination, is the sense line. But this isn't to be mistaken with the main power line that actually charges your car. This is a sense circuit with like 18 or 20 gauge wires, so definitely not to be confused with the main power. And the last thing I want to show you guys before I took it for a drive are these quick release decklid pins, or quick disconnect, whatever you want to call them. And how they work, it's basically, you know, it's kind of hard to climb under here all the time when I'm doing wiring and stuff. And also, like, if you ever go to a car show or something, it makes it kind of easy to take it off. But essentially what you do is, you can see I've already started, you drive out the pins in the hinge and you replace it with these quick disconnect ones. You can move the spring out of the way and it actually comes out. It's just hard to do with one hand. But what I'm having trouble with, actually this side it might clear, this side it probably won't, but the pins actually aren't gonna come out, I don't think, with the punch. So we'll probably have to just, I only put one bolt on each side because I had a feeling it was gonna come off. So we'll pull it off, finish removing these hinges, probably drill it out so it's just a slip fit for this, and then we'll put it all back together. So now you can see with the pins out, basically it leaves you with just this here and the mating piece on the deck lid, and then this guy, now I have it open, you can see will just be your replacement pin, and we'll get rid of the spring, but we won't need it anymore because we'll just take off the hood if we need to go under there. We could also keep like a small stick or something as a hood prop if we want, but I don't think that would be necessary. All right, so we got the holes drilled out, everything's good to go. This will be my first shot, so hopefully I can demonstrate how easy this is gonna be. Cool, not bad. Hopefully it's still, they didn't move around too much. Ooh, not bad at all. No, I'm happy with that. I'm fine with that. Awesome. Yeah, that wasn't too bad. So basically that's all we'd ever have to do to take it off and on. And you just move the wire here to lock it in place. So it never slides out. These are a pretty good slip fit, so I'm hoping that I won't have an issue with that. And then the other thing you just have to do real quick is, this is kind of a pain in the butt, but use your brain, right? Or I should say use your use your head. Just reconnect these wires. Driving pretty good. With that said, we did have some issues. I ran out to get gas and I couldn't start it when I was at the pump. I'm not sure because it was saying on the Megasquirt that we had about 12.5 volts, which I think is accurate.
The alternator was charging. I think it has to do with some hot starter issues. Like because the car was up to temp, it was at like, I don't know, even when I couldn't get it to start near the end, it was still at like 155 in the coolant. So I'm wondering if we're having issues with the starter getting too hot and not being able to, from what I understand, if the starter gets hot, it drains more current or something along those lines, or it's harder for current to get to it. So therefore, it's basically draining the juice and not turning over the starter. So I think that's the problem we're having, because my wife came, picked me up, and we jumped it. But I don't think it was really that the battery was dead. I think it was just that her car had that 14 or whatever so volts, because it was running off the alternator, that might have been just enough juice to get the starter going. I'm not positive, but that's my theory, because I really haven't had issues with the battery. I mean, I literally started it up after sitting for a few days and it was fine. The only difference was I drove it and it got hot. So to me, that feels like it was the battery. I mean, sorry, it feels like it was the starter, but we'll dig in and we'll figure it out. I mean, I've never changed the starter. This is the original Type 1 Super Beetle starter from my understanding. So, I mean, I'll either upgrade it or I will go for something aftermarket. Let me know in the comments below what you guys think, because I'm not really that experienced with this stuff. All right, so with all that, really appreciate the support. Thank you for tuning in. Make sure to share with your friends, hit the like button, subscribe for more content. Hope to see you again soon.